Hello, everyone. Welcome to the FM Navigator podcast from IFMA's Corporate Facilities Council. I am very happy to have our guest today, Craig Domeracki. He is a great leader that I've had the opportunity to work under. And as you all know, IFMA's Corporate Facilities Council, our goal is to help senior level FMs navigate their career. And the difficult part isn't setting your HVAC set points at that level. It's working with people. It's being a leader and what all that means. And our council is focused on helping people develop those skill sets. And it's not about the HVAC set points, but managing the people that do that on your team, which is a completely different skill set. And I am happy to have Craig here because not only do I know Craig as an exceptional leader, but he's somebody I've actually worked under in the past. And it was a very pivotal point in my life to work under Craig because I've said this before, and this is completely true. He was the first executive that I ever wanted to emulate. He was a person that I saw define clear strategy and goals and a pathway to get there, but also someone that operated from what I thought was a strong ethical standpoint without any ego. And that was so different than what I had seen up until that point. So it was very attractive. And the nanosecond I recognized that in Craig, I opened my eyes and my ears, and I just watched and listened and absorbed. So for me to have Craig here today to talk to us is just a very exciting, wonderful thing. And I'm glad to have you here. So Craig, welcome to the FM Navigator podcast.
Thanks, Wayne. It's an honor to be here, and I look forward to the conversation we have on these topics today. Just so everybody can understand a little bit about me beyond what you've said is that I've worked for almost any size company, from a startup to a turnaround to middle-sized company to leading major regions for a Fortune 50 company. And I've served in, middle management roles. I've served as COO, CFO, and CEO. I've been on boards, am on boards, and also faculty at a business school. So I would never claim to know everything. I just know through those experiences, I've gained a lot of knowledge and made an awful lot of mistakes and fortunately learned from those mistakes. So thank you again for having me.
Oh, wonderful. So I mentioned that my observation of you and what you did tactically and strategically, but I think underpinning all of that is something else. Those things don't just exist in a vacuum or grow out of nothing. There's a foundation for those things. There has to be a foundation on which those things are built. And companies have a culture. Each company might have a slightly different culture, the way they do things. But as individuals, the way we operate in those cultures, I think, has a lot to do with ethics. And you and I have had conversations in the past about business ethics, and that conversation is becoming even more interesting as time goes by and as new generations come into being. But I've noticed that the way you were operating, it wasn't just in a vacuum, or it wasn't just a business book routine, that there was something else under all of that. And from our conversations, I think it had a lot to do with ethics and that phrase business ethics too, as well. And I think that's an area where, let's spend some time there and then transition a little bit later into talking about leadership roles. I think, and those two things I think are interrelated. But what does the term, when I say business ethics, what does the term business ethics mean to you, and how would you describe that?
Wayne, what it means to me is really a code of conduct that drives the behavior of employees in an organization. And that goes way beyond legal responsibilities. To me, legal responsibilities is an easy thing. It's really gets way beyond that. And how do you as an employee treat other employees and all other internal constituents, but just as important as external constituents like vendors, customers, et cetera. So it's really that conduct that drives that employee behavior from my perspective.
And there's that saying that, and I've used it myself, is that there's some things you can teach at the table and there's some things that people bring to the table. And I would think ethics, in some ways, I think you can learn from other people and maybe observe an ethic and mimic that ethic. But is this something where you have noticed this is you're looking for people to bring a strong moral ethic to their role when you're hiring people or interviewing people. How do you how can you judge that in a situation? Because you could hire someone who ends up having very divergent ethical frameworks from the organization and from humanity in general.
Yeah, I think that I mean, what you're talking about is you have business ethics, which is the behaviors in your organization, that you've got personal ethics. And ideally, when you join an organization, at least from my perspective, hopefully your personal ethics align with the business ethics of that organization. If they don't, then, I think you're going to have a challenge in that organization. But as it relates to, looking at people and deciding who fits in an organization, obviously to me, that's a skill you build up over time and through experience. But the things that I have learned to do in that process to try to understand does a person fit or not is, I ask a lot of questions and a lot of listening. And what I try to do is try to put them into a tough situation, a lot of tough business situations to see how they would react. Not only how they react verbally, but how do they react, body wise, and are they comfortable, uncomfortable, and as you know, Wayne, when you start asking questions like that, the answers you get are amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I will ask questions that clearly are unethical as it relates to the organization, but they're tough situations. It could be something as simple as, do you fabricate information in the sales process just to get a sale to meet a quarterly quota? I could go on and on with examples, but I try to get into someone's head and ask them and put them in those tough situations. And obviously, as part of the process, I have those people talk with my peers, interview with other people in the organization. And I think one of the difference nowadays is that I think most organizations spend a lot more time on fit, in addition to do they have the technical expertise. But I think there was a time, at least early in my career, was all focused on technical expertise. And people really didn't think about fit. They were just looking to fill a hole in an organization. Now I think that people realize that's a short-term focus. And if you don't bring someone in that doesn't fit, it gets negative quickly. So those are the
Yeah.
couple of things I try.
That's something that I've been trying to champion for a long time with organizations is the hire slow concept, and not just fill organizations with warm bodies. That I've picked up some tips from different people that I've worked with, and the way I've had other people describe it is they want to intentionally push people a little off balance during that interview phase. They want to create an opening for true self to be revealed and true answers. And I think not only do our approaches, behaviors, and strategies maybe get more sophisticated as leaders, but how we interview people becomes more sophisticated. We're not asking softball questions. We might be asking a question in a way that says, well, how would you come in and change the organization? Might be a question, knowing that you don't want anybody to change the organization at this phase of the business.
Right.
So you want to see if their answer is, well, that depends. And I always want to hear more "that depends" responses when I talk to experts, because it says that they think in nuance about these things. And I think ethics is a important part. But I in looking at what I see happen when someone comes into an organization, sometimes you have organizations which do have a strong cultural ethic. They do have um, an underpinning to all of that approach. But then I also see organizations where, and I call them a den of vipers, where maybe they've run out all the good people, maybe they've run out the angels, the people who maybe said, "Look, I can't play in the sandbox," because, as you're saying, that there's a friction between their personal ethic and the business ethic. And I think where I've seen that come into play a lot is, you come into an organization and realize, oh, wow, I think I made a mistake coming here. This is a brood of vipers here. Where's the goodness? And I think if you look back at an organization, one of the things people will face in an organization at some point when they become a leader, especially a senior leader, they might be asked to circle the wagons. and around someone or something that is either against the company's culture or even against the personal culture, personal ethic that a person has. And at that point, the person has a decision to make. Do I circle the wagons around this bad actor to protect the organization? And let's say it's something bad. Let's say it's something sexual harassment. Let's say it's something along those lines that are out there, and we're asked to deal with that. How does, and this is a tough question, Craig. I mean, how does a person in an organization juggle the protection of the organization and its goals and its mission and deal with bad actors when you're being asked to be a company guy and toe the line?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's an awful lot of different questions in there. And I'll try to kind of attack them one at a time. First of all, you always have to remember why you're there at the company, right? You're there to help make the company successful, which means, growing the company, making money, being productive, being ethical, and do all those things legally, right? I mean, fundamentally, that's what a business is supposed to do. So you have to look at your relationship and your responsibility to that. So if there's a bad actor doing something, whether it's illegal, unethical, or whatever, I mean, you have a responsibility to the company. And the good thing now versus, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, um, if you found something like that, you were kind of on your own. Now there's all kinds of new laws and regulations. And, in most companies, there's a hotline to call if you're aware of something. But I mean, you have a responsibility to company to do something. And, I've faced those decisions, really hard ones in my career. And what keeps me focused is, what am I here to do? My job here is not to protect somebody. My job here is to produce the results and the goals of the company. So it's really, Wayne, where I find that most is, especially at the senior level, is it's somebody that's been around for a while and has helped, and they were great. They helped make the company successful through a phase. And now the company's going through a change into another phase, and they can't grip that reality. They're using their same old tools when new tools are needed, to just use a term generically. And, and I think we all face that at some point or another in our career. And can we adjust for the change in the organization or not? And some people make and some don't. And if they don't, the organization has to do something about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the what in the book E-Myth by Michael Gerber, he touches on that point that oftentimes we promote people who are good technicians in their role, tacticians, and put them over other people to lead them. And it's a different skill set, and they keep grappling for those same tools and skill sets, and that's just scalable as you go up into leadership. And I think you're right. There has been a change. I mean, I've observed the older executives where there were some more traditionally bad behaviors that were acceptable in the Mad Men days, that have been either culturally marginalized or legally marginalized. And I think that a lot of times you'll see some of those behaviors go underground. At least if somebody has some of those behaviors and thoughts, if they're able to at least keep them to themselves instead of acting on them, even though they still have the thoughts, at least they're not in a situation where they could be putting the organization or the team members at risk with those kinds of things. But I guess you've spent your career has spanned a lot of different roles and over time. What have you, other than new rules and regs that have happened, what about the people? Have you noticed a change in the behavior and a change of ethics during the period of your career? So I've observed kind of that older guard and working with them and how they behaved and some of the things that they've said, and kind of have watched them exit the playing field as they retire, this generation. What are you seeing as a difference or change in younger generations, especially since you're a professor? What are you seeing in your students even?
Yeah, I think, Wayne, first of all, it's hard to generalize. So I want to
Mm,
put a disclaimer on it. If I say something about a generation, that doesn't mean it's a universal comment.
agreed.
It really is an overall, what do I see as a trend generally? And couple observations, and then I'll give you an example from a professor standpoint. One is it's it's what's in it for me versus what's best for the organization, and I've seen that evolve over time. More people focused on themselves versus what's right for the organization, which is clearly an ethical issue. You know, the other issue I've seen is people less willing to come forward, even though I would argue there's much more protective channels to go through now to report either ethical issues, behavior, or legal issues about, fellow employees. It's those kinds of things. And, from a broad trend perspective, and maybe I'm a little biased here, is that when I started my career, I saw personal ethics and business ethics pretty much aligned. And over time, I've seen that disparity between the two grow. And by that, I mean, I'm not saying people aren't raised without values now. I think business ethics are being stretched a little more now with the drive towards profitability, the drive towards reporting quarterly results, the drive towards competitiveness. It really forces, especially senior leaders, more into that gray area,
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of my couple top things that I've seen over time. From a professor's perspective, typically what I teach is an entrepreneurship class, and basically it's how to write a business plan for a business idea. So it could be a new idea or just a new idea in a company that you want to push. And I take a couple classes and I teach business ethics. And what I ask these students is I kind of peel an onion. I say, so you're in class, is it okay to cheat on a test? And typically 80 to 90% people say, sure it is. And I say, okay, now why? Or why do you do that? Well, I can get away with it. So then I ask the next question. I say, you guys, typically that class is senior undergrads. And I say, well, most of you are interviewing for jobs right now. Is it okay to lie on the interview? And they said, yes. And I say, why? And they say, for the same reason. I said, first of all, before I say any more, I'm never going to hire any of you guys. Because if you're lying now, you're definitely going to lie on your job, because this is simple stuff, And, it's just, I can't explain all the factors, because obviously there's all kinds of how people are raised, what experiences they've been through in life, all those things that impact how we think. It's just that, when I first started asking that question like 6 or 7 years ago, it just kind of shocked me that people thought it was so unacceptable. So then I give him the example of, the engineer that cut a quarter on when they were building the Hoover Dam, and it ended up costing them $10 million, in the 1930s, which would probably be, a couple $100 million now. And I said, do you want engineers cutting corners? I don't. I don't want engineers lying. They're the people that build our world, So anyway, that's just kind of a professor and, what I'm hearing from people nowadays, which, is concerning, but our job is to try to help them learn other things.
And I think the data bears that out too, from what we've seen coming out in terms of statistics about cheating, pushing the the envelope a little bit. So there was one stat 2 Januaries ago that came out that said that 45% of Americans do not understand the difference between fact and opinion 50% of the time.
Wow.
And that was a pretty scary stat.
Yeah.
So, and I think that all of those things, I think there's an infection of maybe relativism and some other things that are, and narcissism, I think, that are infecting us as well to do that. But my interest here too, in terms, you just got me thinking about AI and artificial intelligence, and having a daughter who's just about finished up with college. She's taught me more about AI than anybody in anything I've ever seen. And so I had this conversation with her. I said, so what's going on with ChatGPT, and how do you use it, and how are your fellow students using it? What's the skinny here? And And she said, look, it's fantastic. If I have a problem in calculus, I can say, give me 22 other problems just like this for me to practice on. And you snap your fingers and there they are. Or you say, teach me covalent bonds in organic chemistry as if I'm a kindergartner. And it says, okay, the little bunny jumps through the hole, and it makes it all very easy. But she said, using ChatGPT to completely write a presentation, she says she believes is unethical to do that, because not only are you not going to learn what's supposed to be in the content of your paper, but she says the professors are also getting wise and putting certain keywords in there that trigger AI to do something they'll be able to find. But what I've also seen is one of the standard interview questions now that companies are asking is, how will you use AI to make our business more productive? And it kind of crystallized something for me, Craig, where you're in school and up till the moment you get your diploma, it's unethical to use AI to increase your productivity and abilities. But the minute you get your diploma and get hired, it's encouraged and expected for you to do that. And I find that to be an interesting line, that no one's going to tell you what that line is unless you have that line in you already. Unless you self-police in college to say, I will not cross this line. And I'm fascinated with that, honestly. I'm fascinated with that. And you say that might be something they learned as a child, or something that was modeled for them. But I'm worried that line will be so blurred and then just trampled over, that it's we're going to keep pushing back that ethical learning, so that we end up having somebody who has no line that they won't cross, as long as it increases their stature, or even, it could even be the stature of the organization. So how do you see AI kind of functioning in this, and really maybe that self-policing that one must bring to the table?
Yeah, Wayne, let me say a couple things so people understand my position. One is, first of all, AI can be defined a million different ways. I simplistically look at AI as a tool, just like a hammer or anything else. I view it as a tool. The other thing I would say is, I am definitely not an expert on AI, but I will say, like you probably, I read tons because I want to understand it. And I use ChatGPT. I mean, I used it for something very simple. My wife said, "You never cook." So I said, "I'm going to cook a meatloaf." So I said, "How can I cook a great meatloaf on ChatGPT?" And I cooked it. My wife loved it. She said, "The best meatloaf I ever had." So there's value in this stuff, right? So just a couple of those disclaimers. Now, when you look at education versus the business world, and again, I teach and I spent my life in this business world. That doesn't make me an expert, but I think there's a use for that tool in both environments. And it's like anything else. A tool can be used for good things and used for bad things, right? And I think either way it needs monitoring, whether it's in the educational world or the business world, because we all assume everything that comes up is true. And I tell students, I tell my own kids, I said, God, you got to make sure whatever's coming up, you assume it's true. It may not even be true. You got to do at least one level of, truth, diligence, or whatever you want to call it. So the difference I see between education and business is, what's the goal of education, versus what's the goal of business? To me, the business of education is to, productively and fully do everything you can to educate your students, whether they're high school or college or whatever, and whatever that means. And to me, that doesn't mean just the end point. It's not just getting the mathematical answer, or it's just not the end product of having a good paper you wrote. It's about, what does it take to get from the beginning to the end. So to me, to do a math problem, you can get the answer, but there's so much in the learning and education process that you learn without even knowing it, working out that problem. Just making your brain work through that forces you to get analytical and review options and fail and learn and all those things, so that, if you get the right answer, that's great. And I've done ChatGPT math, And it's great to get an answer, but when you're trying to educate somebody, if they're not getting that middle piece of how do you get from point A to point B and working your brain that way, that's a weakness. Whereas, or writing a paper, you may get AI to write a great paper and you hand it in or whatever, and that's okay. But it's that whole process of creating it, new ideas, actually having your own thoughts in there. And it was interesting. A couple of weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article, and you may have seen it. The title was "When Your Child Uses AI to Cheat." Hmm. And, I got done reading that article. Boy, I could argue either side. I'm sold either side. But it really talked about the students and what they felt that they were missing in the process after they cheated. Mm-hmm. On the business side, if I'm hired by somebody to drive results, right? I'm paid to either grow, I'm paid to be productive, I'm paid to operate efficiently, I'm paid to do something to get to an end point, right? And you use whatever tools legally I can to do that. I think that my view is by the time you get to the working world, hopefully you've been trained in some of those thought processes and everything else. So when you jump into AI, you have those skills as well as knowing how to get to the endpoint. So just jumping to the endpoint is not a bad thing. Where you're going to get caught is, not caught, but where you're going to suffer is if you're sitting in a board meeting or a senior management meeting or whatever, and someone starts asking you questions and really jumping into a topic, you got to know what you're talking about. You can lose credibility really, really quick if a senior leader, and there's at least one, CEO or CFO that asks some esoteric question, and you better know the answer. And ChatGPT is not going to be in that room with you, Right. So anyway, I just think you have somewhat different goals in education, what you're trying to do for the students versus business, what your goals are. And I think you really have to, when you're trying to analyze those two environments, look at them a little differently. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think like, for example, when you're teaching an entrepreneurial class, as you do, I'm sure one of the topics comes up with, okay, when you're doing your business plan, you need to back into what your revenue per hour needs to be so you can calculate, are there enough hours in the day for you to generate the revenue you need to throw the profit to the bottom line to exist?
Right.
I could ask ChatGPT to figure all of that out.
Right.
But do I know the individual components that those decisions are made from, all the moving parts, all the moving pieces, which when you're in that boardroom meeting, that nuance is necessary to look at those moving pieces and have some understanding of that. And I would even envision, give it a couple of years, and even that last statement I made might be out of date, depending on what AI can do and how we use it. It could be live Star Trek where the computer's in the boardroom with us, and it's part of it, and it's a member of the board talking and answering those questions. But I also think too that there is a de-evolution that can happen where it's not only just people not learning and picking these things up and developing these neural connections, but it's also a slouching toward mediocrity. Technology has, where we put technology in people's hands to say, look, you too can be a presenter with PowerPoint, or you too can be a CPA with Excel. And we put these sophisticated tools in the hands of mediocre people, and potentially people without a guiding ethic. They'll produce more mediocrity and more unethical things with it, is what I find interesting, scary. Wait and see. Let's see what happens. But we are creating, I think, some more mediocrity, at least right now with AI, because the diversity of humanity, not just in all of our quirks and, foibles, but also just in terms of how we can see things differently and the way we frame things. And then you match your framing with Susie's framing, and then you come up with a completely new idea. And I think a lot of that is what I am concerned about changing, is us more mediocrity and less humanity. And I don't think that's a healthy mix. And I think how we retain that has a lot to do with what will be our next topic when we get to it eventually here, is on leadership. But I mean, what do you? I know there's a lot in that.
I think a great example, a great practical example of that, Wayne, is that whether it's a business setting or an educational setting, is that if you have a group, right, and you're talking about something, if I asked everybody to research a topic, they're all going to go to ChatGPT and probably get all the same answers.
Mm-hmm.
And where I see some of the best ideas coming up is a dialogue between a group of people. And to be honest with you, some of the best ideas I personally come up with weren't even in my head until I heard other people talk and say stuff. And I said, you know what? I never thought about this, or I never thought about that. And I just think that the mediocrity thing and lack of creativity can happen very quickly if we lose some of these human things where a lot of value is added. Hopefully
Yeah,
that makes sense.
it does, and I think that is technically classified under an ethic because. I mean, what is an ethic? An ethic is a guiding principle, whether that's a principle or principles decided by the organization. Here's how we behave. Here's how we act. Um, Not aspirationally, but really. But I think it's also here's how I act within that organization as well. And if I am, what lines am I willing to cross to make something happen? And I guess this kind of leads to another question I wanted to ask you. And I've been told this myself, okay, especially as a younger person, and I've been very fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to always have worked either directly under executive boards or on executive boards. So I've had a firsthand seat to this kind of question here, and that is, in so many words, I've been told sometimes, Wayne, you're being naive for being a Boy Scout. That's not the way the world works. It's dog eat dog. Um, Gird your loins. They're willing to cross that line and do that, so you should be willing to also. All's fair in love and war. Insert cliche here, but the best I could come up with, Craig, to that is there's an old song by Jerry Rafferty, and I know I'm dating myself there, but it was wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. It is the approach of how to deal with this kind of world and thinking. But what do you say to that kind of thinking, that someone is coming in there with an ethic and they're being the Boy or Girl Scout, and they're being told, hey, don't be naive, sunshine. This isn't the way the world works. What do you have to say about that?
Well, first of all, it depends on how you define Boy Scout, right, or
Hmm.
Girl Scout. Um, but so let me put it into context. I define being a Boy Scout as, some of the behaviors, frankly, Boy Scouts have to take an oath to, whether it's being loyal, trustworthy, brave, all those kinds of things. My short answer to your question is there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There are organizations where you'll be the minority, unfortunately, and that fundamentally gets back to you want to be in that kind of organization or not. But if the either unethical or illegal behavior is a minority, and you're trying to be the so-called or quote unquote Boy Scout, I, I believe I've been that kind of person. Um, and sometimes that goes at risk, and you're going against the norm, and it's really hard to understand the point I'm about to make when you're young in your career, you're a middle manager. But I've realized over time that, those people that are doing the unethical, illegal things and not being the quote unquote Boy Scout, it eventually comes back to haunt them. And, I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I'll give you one example that jumps out at me personally. So I was running a $6 billion section of a Fortune 50 company, right? And we had 30,000 job classifications. And what the company decided to do is put those job classifications into 8 bands. So they went from 30,000 separate job titles to groupings of 8 bands. Unfortunately, what happened along that way is some weird things happened. And one thing that happened to me, really my team, is everybody that reported to me, was making less money than the person I would bring in at that same job level. And so like 3 people came to me, and these are people making, medium 6 figures, a lot of money. And they said, they would come to me and say, so tell me, does that make sense that I could leave and come back and make more money? So, I went to our national HR people and say, I got to do something for these people. I owe it to them. And I had 3 other peers in the organization. And I was the only one went to battle and ultimately war to get this. And people kept asking me, why are you doing this? You're putting your job at risk. I said, part of my personal ethics, it's do unto others as you want it done to you. I mean, if this happened to me, I would want my boss fighting for me because it's just not right. It is not right. So, you could call that a Boy Scout mentality, but I was a minority and none of my peers were making that battle. Eventually I won. I may have lost a lot of political capital doing that, but I'm still here talking today and I still did okay in life. So it was okay to be a Boy Scout. So that was just kind of one example I would give you.
Yeah, I like the head on the pillow quotient.
Yeah.
That's a good one. As you brought that up, I started thinking that there was a time I was working with an executive who was working on a quarterly business review, and I'm, I'm the computer guy, I'm the graphic guy at the time, and the data collection guy. So I was collecting all this data on this client, and I showed the data and showed the graphing, and this executive said, "Well, make the graph look like this," and adjusted it. I said, "I don't understand." He said, "I don't want it to look like this. I want it to look." I said, "But that's not what the data shows," and that was the "don't be naive." Don't be naive. This is what we want them to think is happening. And when you're, a 20-something kid, and this is the top executive in a company telling you to do this, what do? You observe, you watch, you listen, of course. And then maybe like me, you get a new mortgage and a young baby, and it's the middle of a recession. And you're some of the executives you're working with are saying some pretty off-color things, that are number one. The questions I say is, who do you think I am that you can say these things to me or in front of me that I would just accept this? And secondly, you can think those if you want, but to be foolish enough to say those things out loud puts this company and this organization at risk. So the confidence in their ability for decision making across the board, in my mind, is affected. Because if I know you're willing to do that with one of your clients, what are you willing to do with your employees? If I know that you're willing to talk about your employees in ways that are pre-me too and some other things, and you just throw those things about, how cautious are you with the legality issues of our company? And it makes you question everything. So that pillow quotient, I think, is a big thing, to be able to lay your head on your pillow, and also know, Craig, too, that those people that you fought for, I bet dollars to donuts that if you talk to any of them, they would remember their experience with you and remember that you stood up at your own peril in some ways to fight for them, and that's something that you can't finagle or buy or manufacture. That comes from the real Boy or Girl Scout.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 Well, those are good questions.
Yeah. Well, I guess another thing too that I've used, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. And again, I step into a lot of things just organically, Craig, by finding what works and what doesn't work. And if I drop this backdrop behind me, you would see the bookshelf behind me, and I've learned a lot from reading, the classics, Good to Great, and all those kinds of things. But to me, one of the things I stumbled into is if there is a strong strategy, a clearly articulated strategy, and a mission, vision, all the basics, that you can point to that when there is divergent behavior rather than to the person. So I think sometimes what we worry about is we're going to say to the person, we don't like you, or what you're doing is wrong, or you're not a good employee, when there is clear strategy, which I argue a lot of companies don't have an actual clear strategy. I think there's a lot of people lurching from one urgent thing to the next. But if you point to the strategy and say what you're doing and the way you're behaving does not align with the strategy. So how when you're counseling or uh, correcting or performance enhancing an employee maybe who's off the rails a little bit here, but still in that first phase of that where you're maybe trying to fix it or at least document it, what kind of conversations are you having? What kind of hard because I know I've seen you have hard conversations, and sometimes you just say, "Oof, these are God, I bet better him than me." But how do you handle those kinds of hard conversations with people who have or are going off the rails? That first one where you notice it.
Yeah, I would agree with you that it's um, to personally attack someone, that really doesn't get you anywhere other than, you've probably created at a minimum of short-term enemy. So it's always good to tie it back to, the business goals and, the ethics of the company and everything else. And, I mean, my view has always been to be honest and direct because I honestly don't know how to be any other way. And because that way an employee or frankly a customer can understand, even if they don't like the information. I mean, how many times have you had to go to a customer and give them information they're not going to like?
Mhm.
But if you hem and haw and beat around the bush, you know, that's not good. And I look at the same with an employee. I mean, you owe it to be honest and direct with them so they know if there's a gap, they know how to cure it, right? And then they got to decide, am I going to cure it or not? And I don't know. I mean, it's some of this gets back to the culture of an organization. The culture I've always tried to live by is failing is okay. As long as you learn by it and don't make the same mistake over and over again. So, while I'm being direct and honest with someone, I do want them to understand that I'm going to give them a chance and that they do have a chance. And it's okay to make a mistake. And it's okay to make a mistake with me. Just, learn from it and let's move on. And, here's what you need to do to make that happen. And as you know, some people make the adjustment and some don't. And then you just have to go to the next level.
Yeah. Yeah, those behaviors of failing forward, uh, admitting wrongs, I think is a key thing for leaders to do. And again, this is something that um, I've actually in some leadership classes I've taught here at IFMA have mentioned this, but again, I don't know. I can't point to a single book that said to do this. I think this is just something, Craig. I learned so much from what I did not want to be like in leaders, from leaders I think that I didn't respect or didn't admire or didn't see a lot of value in. I mean, obviously, I'm not throwing baby out with the bathwater. I did learn things even from unethical or challenging leaders. Um, but I think the opportunities to say you're sorry when in front of your team is golden. If you have an opportunity to, in front of everybody, say, "Oh, guys, this was my fault. Susie had that great idea at the last meeting, and I discounted it and said we should do this. Turns out Susie was right." And when people in a team see their leader admitting that they were wrong, genuinely, not one of those phony little "I'm putting on the
Mhm.
sorry show now," and admitting that, I think that creates that culture. I think it lays the groundwork to say we're safe here to be able to do that, and then all of a sudden the fresh air comes into the room, and it fosters some creativity. I think over time, leaders that demonstrate that um, that grace when someone fails is okay. So what did we do here, and how could we learn, and how can we move forward on this? I mean, all this seems like very basic, but I talk to people, in different industries and so forth, and I think uh, there was a class I taught for IFMA in 2022 called "How to Manage Narcissists, Naysayers, and Know-It-Alls," and I, next month I'll be teaching that class again. And I think I've taught it to over like 27 IFMA chapters, something like that. And that's nothing to do with me. It's this we're dealing with, I think, a lot of challenging leaders who are approaching that role narcissistically. And part of that is because I think that We value, it's a playbook almost for success. Grandiosity is almost a boldness, if you want to put a positive spin on it, that we like that, but that oftentimes comes with the narcissistic baggage that comes with it with some leaders. And, you know, you're going to encounter that in the upper levels of an organization because those people tend to rise to the top because they're willing to do the things that other people won't do. They're willing to step on the things that other people won't do. So when you're in that board meeting, Craig, and you've got a mix of these people, like-minded people, but you've also have people that cross a line in a heartbeat, sell their grandmother down the river, and you're navigating in this kind of environment, are you looking to gain consensus among like-minded people? Are you working with stakeholders to try to marginalize that kind of person's thinking? How do you deal with the people or persons on your executive board who are approaching things with this with an ethic that personally is challenging and one that's against the organization, but they're either your peer or higher on that board?
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of questions there. One is, um, if I'm going to the board meeting and I've got to present on a topic that I'm supposed to be, presenting on and trying to make a point, you know, prior to the meeting, I try to rally as many people as I can, right? Because I don't, I want to come out of there with a yes if I'm trying to get a decision. And I want people to understand where I'm coming from, whether they say approve or not approve. That's their call, but I at least want to do my pitch, right? To try to get whatever I think I should be getting for, whatever I'm pitching. If there are naysayers in that room, you know, typically I'm going to know beforehand who's a naysayer, right? Or narcissistic or whatever. So, I hate to put it this way, but I will anyway. You always want to keep your enemies close, right? So if I recognize those people and know who they are, I'm going to talk to them before the meeting. And I'm going to say, this is where I'm coming from. I know you may not agree with this or whatever, but I want you to understand where I'm coming from on this. And, feel free to ask me any questions or anything you want, but you don't want to go into a high level meeting surprising anybody, you know? So I don't know. I learned, again, one of those things you learn the hard way. You always think you have the best idea in the room, because you've sold yourself completely, but you really got to rally resources, at least educate resources before you go into that meeting. So it's not like you're blindsiding everybody, but, and hopefully things are calm. But if someone starts to act, for lack of a better term, an idiot in the meeting and an about face from what you may have talked about beforehand, I personally just normally they're going to embarrass themselves. And I just let that happen, and, I don't, in so many words, they're typically trying to pick a fight because I like to fight. And I refuse to get into those kind of fights until we're outside the room. Then we can do battle. But I don't know, usually those, in my experience, if they're going to wage war in a meeting like that, counter to what you thought they were going to do, then people see it, people see it. It gets, I wouldn't say it's the Boy Scout thing, but people see rational versus irrational,
Yeah, it has a stench to it. It definitely has an odor
Yeah.
to
And
that
then,
behavior.
then you just hope the organization, if I'm not the CEO, let's just say I'm a level below the CEO, and so is this other person. You know, I, I would probably go to the CEO and say, did you see what I saw in there? I mean, did you digest the same thing, or did you see something different in there? And then the conversation would evolve from there, and then you'd get an understanding, if you really felt something should be done, were they going to do something about it or not? And that's where you get into, ethics and, all
Right.
those kind of issues we talked about.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me of, I just stumbled across as one of these former Navy SEALs that now does leadership training, and amazing the lessons that transfer over from the battlefield to the boardroom.
Yeah.
But one of the things he was saying is, if you run across somebody with this huge ego that's trying to trample you with their ego, he said the answer back to that is not for you to inflate your ego. The
Right.
answer is to subjugate or subordinate your ego, and remain calm and focus on the strategy and the task at hand and aligning with that. And I think a lot of what you just said kind of reminded me of that. That we do at that level in organization. Sometimes you do have a lot of bravado that goes along with those roles, and oftentimes it's a power play as opposed to being able to point to winning. And it's interesting too. Maybe this is a good time for us to transfer into maybe talking about leadership here, and especially being a new. I really want to focus on what happens when you're a new leader coming into an organization. In other words, you weren't promoted up the chain into that organization, but you were hired in from the outside. And this is something I have firsthand observation of you, because this is where I first encountered you. And let's go back down memory lane, and let me tell you my perspective of what I witnessed when I first was introduced to you. I noticed before you opened your mouth on anything, you visited every single person in that company. You went around systematically, rather, visited this location, interviewed everybody, and the first question out of your mouth: "What can I do to help you become more successful?" And you didn't come with any pronouncements. You didn't. There were no. So okay, if I okay, I understand. And I remember saying, and this is going to make you make you laugh here, but I remember after you left, I was talking to some of the reps, and I said, do you realize if you told him you needed a pony to meet your sales goals, there would be a pony on your doorstep tomorrow. If you could justify to him that that's what you needed to meet your goals, he's going to help you do that if you can justify it. I mean, I was being exaggerating there, but saying that he was here to ask you what you needed, and not for excuses or anything else. And he is the kind of person that will support you with those things. He's listening, so you need to tell him. And I was just very impressed with your use of ears over speech at that point in time. And then what I noticed is you gathered all of those threads together. You looked for themes, you looked for big levers to pull, and when you finally did introduce yourself and present, you brought all of that to bear, and there was a respect there. Because you listen. Now, there was obviously some people that were threatened from some of the things, but I was very impressed with that. So, tell me about that. Craig, when you take on a role in a new organization, what are you doing before you even accept the role? What kind of questions are you asking of that organization? What are you researching to see if it's even a good fit for you as an executive?
Yeah. A number of things, Wayne, and some of it's the opposite of or similar to what we talked about earlier on one of the ethics questions. But, especially as you get higher up in management, the questions or what you try to find out are less about the technical aspects of the business versus, leadership, behaviors, ethics, culture, support, kind of all those intangible things that you need to be successful. Because technical expertise, I hate to say it, technical expertise is the simple thing. It's the other stuff that's difficult. So, I'm asking some of the same hard questions. I'm asking scenarios like, if I'm interviewing with a board or CEO, it depends on what level I'm coming in at, right? I'm saying, well, let me give you a scenario. I've got 3 divisions that are failing. I've analyzed the organization. I've given you my 5 recommendations. How quickly are you going to let me implement these? I'm going at questions like that to see how they react. Again, not only what comes out of their mouth, but what's their body actions, body movements, and are they getting squeamish and doing those kinds of things, and so I'm getting, and people I'm talking to in the interview phase, I'm doing that. I'm also trying to reach out to anybody I know in the organization, right? And that would include people inside the organization as well as customers and vendors. I mean, what do you guys get? Because as you know, a lot of times the ethics are different. The written ethics are different than what actually happens in an organization.
Mhm.
So I will read the verbiage that might be in an annual report or something they've made public, but I really put more weight in how do they treat their customers? You know, how do they treat employees? You know, I try to find people I knew that maybe work there that don't work there anymore to say, you know, you're outside now. Tell me what actually happens there, you know, and all those kinds of things. So, and I'm doing the obvious things. I'm reading any kind of public information on them. And then what I'll say to these people is, I'll pull a page out of a document and say, this is what you guys say. Give me an example of you actually doing this, whatever this
Mhm.
may be, to see if what they put in their PR stuff actually happens. You know, I'm really trying to find out what's real about the organization versus what's portrayed, and is it similar? And then I really just have to decide, you know, a couple of things. One is, do I think I can do the job? You know, that I think
Mhm.
I'm clear they're asking me to do. The other thing I'm asking them is, you know, what are my goals for 30, 60 days and 12 months? So I know exactly what I'm supposed to achieve. Because then the other question I'm asking myself is, do I think I can achieve those given what I see in this organization? And then obviously the last question I'm trying to get information on and make a decision on is this the right fit for me? Because I think, you know, all of us go on in our careers and at some point or another make a decision. We're so excited about the job, we end up at a place it just doesn't fit, you know. So hopefully
That's
that helps a little bit.
that does, and that especially that last statement that you made is you know, you see that arc in a career where you you're there's a desperation maybe at some point. I need to get a job. I need to pay the bills at a certain point, right? And I've got to do this. But at that senior executive level, you're looking for that fit or where your skill set might be advantageous to that organization, where they'll let you implement the things. And I think someone like you, who I would say has a specialty potentially in realignments and turnarounds. I think you would probably get shoved into the difficult situation, but with difficult situations comes difficult solutions, sometimes that maybe senior leaders don't have the stomach to implement. So I think that that's an important question there to ask as well. You know, the higher up in an organization you are at the senior executive levels, uh, I would, if I'm interviewing someone at that level, I want to hear them asking those questions because it shows me that they understand the sophistication and nuance of this role and this position, as opposed to just trying to impress me. And
You know, Wayne, you know,
and I
you hit the nail on the head. You know, it's where I see the disparity is someone going from middle management to senior management. And if they're I'm interviewing them and they're not asking me some of those tough questions, I'm concerned because they
Mhm.
need to ask the tough questions because I'm bringing them in at a senior level. They're going to have to do some tough things. And people going from middle to senior management have to realize when they're interviewing for a role, I don't know if aggressive, bold, I don't know what the right word is, but you know, that's expected of you in a senior management role, you know?
yeah.
So you may raise a great point.
Yeah, I have a couple of really close FM friends that um, both were in long-term situations in their organization, beloved by all of the staff, and helped grow these companies over decades. Even one of them, and I sat down because we were talking about careers, and I have you know, some insight into this and some advising I could give. And I said, look, you're already doing the role of a VP. They just have not given you the title there, and you're already doing this stuff. And she recognized that when her next job she was hired as a VP and was
Mhm.
put into that role. And I said, look, you know, you're in this role where you're going to be you know, applying for this job or you're going to go for this VP job. Um, the types of things that they are going to be wanting from you are not how are you you know, stocking the toilet paper. And she, I mean, we were joking about that. She knew that. And just to emphasize to her, they want you to dig in. They want you to dig in deep. They want you to point out these issues and problems and so forth, because that's what you're going to get paid for at that level. And it's not about you really saying, I got to get this job. I want this role. It's about demonstrating your competency for that role. and it will come. And I think back to his time I interviewed for a role, and it's always better when you are happily and solidly employed, and then
Mhm.
you interview because you're interviewing from a position of strength, and that exudes. And when you ask a question, and just quick little fun story here, Craig, is it was a panel. There was four people on the staff, the hiring manager and the admin were there, and they're all talking to me. And one of the questions came up, well, how would you deal with issues and problems and so forth? And I said, well, I said, I might be out of pocket here in saying this, but I'm sitting at this table and I can sense there's an elephant in the room among all of you, but I don't know what it is. That would probably be the first thing I would find out is what's going on. And
Mhm.
the look on everybody's faces knew I touched on something. And within a few months after that, I had found there was some unhealthy relationships going on there, an unhealthy relationship on the team that was causing favoritism and some other stuff, and those folks were let go, but it was destroying the team.
Right.
And I was offered that job, but I didn't take it, not for that reason, but for some other reasons. But I that was when it crystallized for me, where I realized I could just jump into that situation and then I'm swimming in the same toxic pool that they are and having to
Right.
deal with the same issues. So I've been very judicious and cautious since that point of not just jumping at an opportunity. And I say this in IFMA all the time, especially for volunteer members. I say, I'm very suspicious of people that jump at a leadership opportunity because it tells me maybe you don't know the cost of leadership, because it is, you're pouring yourself out into other people in an organization, and it's not about you and it's not about padding a resume, and leadership comes at a cost. And I want to see that in people. I want to see people answer me with words like maybe and it depends, as I said before. um, but any thoughts on that?
Well, kind of restate the question, right, Wayne?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So, okay, we obviously said that it's something you want to be very cautious about when you take on a new role and a new position and so forth, and operating from that position of strength. But I guess maybe what I'm saying is to tie it back is, you're coming into an organization, you might do that due diligence, and you might have a good feel for things. Um, but are you ascertaining? And then maybe this is the talk about that book, First 90 Days, that I love. Are you going in knowing if it's a sustaining success position, a realignment, a turnaround, or a start? I mean, obviously, you know it was a startup, but do you know going in whether you're a turnaround or alignment, or they just want you to keep the success going, or are you finding that out, or maybe you're told one thing and then you find something else out once you're there? What's been your experience?
I think all those are true. I think they all happen. I mean, just let me say a couple things. I've been in every stage of a company. I've been in stages of companies where the stage changes overnight. And I've been in companies where different divisions are in different stages, which is really an
Mhm.
interesting dynamic. So I think that obviously your goal is to figure out what it is, right? I have two examples I can think of. I mean, I have a whole lot of examples, but two of them I got into, and the situation changed almost overnight. And it's not because anybody lied to me, it's because circumstances changed. So, one I got into, and I'd have to look back at a calendar, I was probably into it 6 months, and I came in to help lead growth. And it turned very quickly into how do we survive, because it was a function of the economy, drastic economic change. Another time, um, to make the example real simplistic, I was brought in to help grow the company, and it turned into a turnaround overnight because a major regulatory change occurred that dramatically impacted our financials. So all of a sudden, we went from growing to, how are we going to survive financially? And the reason I bring those examples up is, again, when I'm looking at a senior manager, I'm, I may be looking, are they the right person in the short term? But I'm also looking at them, are they flexible as if the circumstances change? Do they have that flexibility? And I mean, it's just because you have to be ready for everything. And frankly, you could be leading multiple divisions, and each division is doing something different. One's going well and one's not. And you got to be able to listen to your folks and understand what's different about them. And, one's a turnaround and one's growing, and then you decide where to put your resources. So, to answer your question, yeah, I'm trying to figure it out, but I'm also going in that situation realizing I'm not assuming someone's lying. I hope they're not lying. Hopefully I figured that out. What I'm thinking about is what other phases could they be getting into very quickly if something doesn't happen right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Yeah. Yeah. So not only are you in that interview process and due diligence process with you're demonstrating your competency to the CEO, whoever it is you're interviewing with here, and the executive team, by asking those hard questions and scenarios and trying to ascertain the phase of the business. But you're also, and this is for our FM listeners here, is to demonstrate your ability around all those issues to adapt as well. It's like, hey, you're hiring me for a realignment, but if all of a sudden this thing goes into full on turnaround, you can maybe touch on some of these skill sets you have or experience you have in these other areas that you may be to some degree Johnny or Jane all seasons here, and be able to work around all of those. I think it's important because we have a lot of, I would argue that the FM world, it's very, one of the things that hinders our people is the desire to do what they used to do because they're comfortable. And that starts as a coordinator. You move into an AFM role, right? It's hard to let go of the event management or the conference room setup, because you know how problematic it could be if it's set up wrong, right? And you got to let go of that and delegate. And then you move from that AFM role to the FM role, where you're even more removed. And then you get into executive level and VP level, and you're managing through a group of people at that point in time, and it can be very, very challenging to let go and take on new sophisticated approaches to things that you have to reach for. And when you're interviewing at that level, you're interviewing typically with people that's what they do, and that's how they manage their people. That CEO, he or she that's been there for 10 years, she knows how to do that already. And they're going to want to see that in you. And I don't think that's something you can manufacture. I think that's something, a skill set that you pick up and learn along the way. It's just being able to demonstrate that to those higher folks. So you mentioned multiple divisions, and you might have a division that's rogue or just not performing, but I tend to think too that sometimes one of those divisions might be rogue because of a sacred cow. And that's one of the things that I observed with you before, is that when you did pull all those threads together from all those interviews and picked a lane and said, this is the strategy, this is what we're doing, here's how we're going to track it, here's where we're going to get there, that there was some resistance among some people. And what if those sacred cows are big revenue generators? What if those sacred cows are the boss's kid? Or even if that they've just been there and they know how to, one of the clients, this is a big one in our industry. One of the clients absolutely loves them, but internally they step all over everybody. How do you handle sacred cows, I guess is the metaphor there.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that, Wayne, but I want to add something to your last question, because I
Sure.
want to get it on the record so that people listening to this can hear it. And one is, anybody interviewing for a senior management role, or any role, frankly, but especially senior management, you know, can look to ask what I would say very simple but material questions. So if I think I'm joining a growing company and that company is raising more money, right? Whether it's public company or private company, a very valid question is, you guys are doing a 50 million, $100 million capital raise, and that's going to be your growth. What happens if that doesn't happen? Are you still going to need me? What's going to happen to the company then? I think, there are some very simple material questions people can ask to find out what they're actually getting into and what the stage of the company is or could be changing overnight. So, whether you're interviewing for a head of HR, head of facilities, head of, anything, you have a right to ask that question as a senior leader. So I just
Mhm.
want to throw that out there.
Excellent point.
As it relates to sacred cows, it's I mean, there's so many different circumstances, right? But I'll mention a couple that have happened in my career. So I was brought into a company, and a person that had my role had done it for 20 years. And, the board and the owners decided that that person wasn't the right person. So intellectually, they got it, but they kept the person in the organization. So what I did is, in that organization, similar to what I did, Wayne, for the same organization we were with, did a lot of investigating and everything else. And unfortunately, it was pretty obvious that with that person staying, I was not going to be able to achieve my goals for that company. So I had to go to the board and say, I mean, you talk about direct. I said, it's him or me. Mm-hmm. And in 2 weeks, he was gone. Mm-hmm. And, he did a great job moving the company from point A to point B, but he was horrible. It was a textbook of, let's just keep doing the same thing. And luckily, the board figured that out. And to this day, that company has done fantastic. I've done that at another company, similar situation. They didn't have the guts to make the move, and they're basically similar to what they were a long time ago. Because normally, sacred cows, it's not a secret. I mean, everybody knows, right? And typically, most people know if they're more of a liability to the company than an asset, right? I mean, you as a senior leader have to figure out, I mean, if you can wipe away that what they're doing is not illegal or unethical, it's just, a pain in the butt, and they're not helping the organization, people know it. And then you just have to decide, are their strengths greater than their weaknesses, and are they still on board for the company? And if the liability's out, no matter where they're at, as a senior leader, you got to do something. Now, where you're at versus where they're at, I mean, that will determine your next actions, right? If you decide to do something. But if it's a sacred cow that's prohibiting the company and you from doing what you have to do, I mean, you gotta nip that in the bud as soon as possible. And what I've learned is, typically, if the end result is the person has to go, normally very few people would disagree with you. And a lot of them will come up to you and say, I don't know why such and such didn't do this a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And the other side is, if they don't, usually if you don't get rid of that person, then it holds the organization back. And that's unfortunate. Then you just have to decide if that's stopping you from reaching your goals, and you got to do something, got to go to plan B.
Yeah. That reminds me of one of the things Simon Sinek talks about, is that if you go into any company in any department and you say, who's the expletive in this department, and they all point to the same person, they all know already who that is. But because he or she is under the protection of something, but they already know, and you'll probably get those thank yous. I think maybe one of the things I observed is that first person who's escorted out because of these things are not good for the organization. And it's not that, hey, I'm a new leader, I'm coming in and flexing my ego. It's, no, you're holding us back. That person who's escorted out sends a signal to the rest of the organization. And I think that does a couple of things I've seen. And even when we worked together, I saw some people then eject themselves because they said, this isn't for me. And fair enough, right? If whether it was because their fiefdom was threatened, or whether it's because, no, I just don't like where the direction's going, or I have a fundamental disagreement. Those are all fair game. But I think there's other people that says, hey, I just better, there's a new sheriff in town, for lack of a better term, and wasn't afraid to enact the law of this organization. But I also worry too about the subterfuge that goes on, because I think of a time, Craig, where once I was with an organization and we're struggling to hire people for roles. And I particularly had to work very hard, do a lot of traveling to try to get somebody into a role. And she was perfect for it. She was extremely, she was just great for this role. And there was a company meeting a week after her first week. And I'm in this company meeting, and it's the kind of everybody sit around at the bar the night before, and everybody's talking, and everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, a large group of people were just doing nothing but bad mouthing the company in front of the person I just worked this hard to hire.
Mhm.
And I felt so bad. I felt so bad for her that she's hearing all this stuff and she's thinking to herself, "Did I just make a huge mistake in doing all of this?" And so, what do you do about that backbiting that occurs where it's not out in the open, but somebody's saying, "Okay, well, I'm just going to try to just either slow roll Craig's changes that he wants to implement, or I'm going to fight, or I'm going to spread slander and rumor around here about things." What are your thoughts on how to handle the subterfuge, maybe that happens under the radar?
Yeah, my preference, it's a horrible analogy, but I always prefer someone punch me in the face versus put a knife in my back when I don't know what's happening. Because then I at least know where they stand.
Mhm.
If and I've had this happen, and there's so many different circumstances, right? You come in as a leader, someone didn't get your job and they're still there and they're one of your reports, or they tried for your job and they're in another department, so you don't even know what's going on over there. Or worse yet, they had your job and they've been moved to another place, but they're still in the company.
Mhm.
You have all those situations in addition to people below them. And, I don't think there's not a mathematical formula to this one. And I don't think Chat GPT can help you with this. I think you have to do your own investigating. I'm a fact-based decision maker. If I hear something, that doesn't mean I believe it. I got to start asking questions. If I didn't witness it myself, I got to see who may have said something. Then, to your point that you made about me earlier, then I need to go to them directly and say, are you out there saying these kinds of things? You really believe it? And all these other things. And then once you get facts, whatever the facts tell you, then you got to act as a senior leader, right? I mean, one of the things, especially if you're a new leader, and you hinted at this a minute ago, is that, a new leader, your people are expecting you to lead. And they're watching you to see if you're willing to lead in tough situations, you know? And they're not saying it, but believe me, they're watching you. And, they're watching you to say, if there's a bunch of people that are, doing a bunch of BS, is this new leader actually going to do something about it or not? And you got to take a stand. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't be humble and fair and all those other things, but you got to act and you got to move. But you really don't want to do that till you're sure you have some facts. And then my view is, as soon as you know the facts, man, you execute immediately to fix that. And if it's as bad as what I would call a cancer, you got to get rid of the cancer. You know.
I totally stole that line from you, because at one point you and I had a conversation about that, and you point blank asked me, "Who is, who is the cancer?" Um, and it took time out of your schedule and plans to find that out, but you consider that incredibly important to understand. So I use that term to this day because it's such an apropos term, as a mimic for what happens, unfortunately, in some of our bodies physically, but it's an excellent analog. Because it will continue to fester and destroy if it's not dealt with, and sometimes it can be corrected, but with extreme suffering and pain to get things in alignment. But one of the things I think I'm thinking through this is that subterfuge, again, like the pillow quotient, it will come back to bite you. And I think one of the places it will show is in KPIs potentially. And so a lot of the FMs at senior levels that we deal with manage a dispersed portfolio across geographies, and they can't be granular. They've got to manage through their generals, for lack of a better term. And you might have rogue generals who are in alignment, generals who was the one that applied for your job and didn't get it, people that you brought in. What are you looking at from division heads and for your generals, what are you looking at to how are you managing them? Because you obviously can't spend unlimited time and hours and minutes and seconds with every single one of them. They're dispatched to do a certain role. How are you managing them through KPIs? And I mean, what frequency of your interaction with them, physical versus virtual or on the phone? Balanced scorecards. I mean, what are you typically using um, to pull these KPIs out of and ensure that these divisions are operating the way you intend them to?
So a couple of things, Wayne. Some of it, I've used KPIs, balanced scorecards, probably every tool out there. And as you know, sometimes, especially in large organizations, those tools are dictated to you.
Mm-hmm.
And, and that's good and bad, right? I mean, you should have a tool and, you should know how the criterion that those tools are tied to, the organization and how all this fits together. I believe in all that stuff. I think where some of it breaks down is some people, there's so much detail that you kind of forget the big picture. And when I look at those tools or any kind of measurements, I try to boil it down as simple as possible. What are the 3 to 5 things you're trying to achieve this year? So that's, and then, if I'm given the flexibility to use different tools, then, I mean, I have my personal preferences, obviously, but when I come in and I've got a number of generals, I mean, as you know, because I think you've talked about it already, I mean, I'm going to spend an awful lot of time visiting them, asking questions, learning about their organization. And I'm doing the exact same thing with every person, because when I come in new, the last thing I want people to think is I'm treating someone differently and special and blah, blah, blah. I mean, you name it, right? The last thing I want to do is, especially if I know somebody. I mean, I've joined organizations where I know some of the people, and the people that don't make me, they just assume I'm going to be better, treat the other people more fairly, which is a horrible assumption, but it happens. So I'm just going to spend an awful lot of time with them, and I'm going to listen to them, and I'm going to do the exact same thing with every person initially. I'm going to want to meet with them. My one-on-ones with them are going to be weekly for a while till I can understand a lot more about these people. And because I want to make sure they understand that they know their business, right? And I'm going to want to make sure I understand it and I know what they need to be successful. And first of all, once I'm confident that I have the right team, because, during that process, you may find out, this person's not going to make it. But let's assume we're at the point where you got all the players are on the field that you want. Then it's a matter of, I believe in the human being aspect, right? Everybody's got different behaviors. Hopefully, if you've developed a team, they're all different. They're not all the same. Because to me, that's one of the definitions of a great team is kind of everybody's different. Then do I really need to talk to this person every week, or can it be every 2 weeks? There's some flexibility, but I'm never so flexible that I'm portraying, again, that this person's special versus other people. And, I'm going out, I'm visiting them and doing all the normal stuff. What do you need? What do you not need? You having any people problems? Giving them the support they need. But, the short answer is I'm much more involved at the beginning till I know that these people know. I believe they know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to let them run their business until they can prove to me that they can. Then I jump in and micromanage more than I would. But I'm normally my natural tendency is hands off until people prove otherwise. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of a high level view without getting into a lot of detail.
And I think that, FMs in our industry can begin to practice that at a much earlier phase where they may only be hindering their own ability to grow and move up in the organization because there's no one there to backfill their position. Pardon me, because they may not have delegated enough or trained someone enough to the point where they can run with the ball. and free them up to be able to move up into senior level roles. I see that a lot because I mean FM is really a clearinghouse for problems in an organization. It's like a black box. You put everybody send your problems here, and we route them and fix them and move on. And it's very tactical in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the challenges we have in FM is aligning our strategy with the demand organization, and having a true strategy and getting out of the cold sweat of tactical, and having those generals that you can trust in these different areas, and knowing that you put this goes to the events team, and the events team is performing. All you need to do is send half an email to them and the thing goes perfectly. So you're not going to have to interact with them, is what I hear you saying, as frequently. But over here you may have your engineering staff. There might be a problem there because you've got some people that might be sacred cows, maybe whatever, and you're having difficulty getting them to get into alignment. You're probably going to be interacting with them on a much more frequent basis. So, and all the while, just rehashing what you said here, all the while, because I want this to sink into me too, that there's not a favoritism between all these people. Yes, you might be very happy with the events team and they're running, and you want to shout from the rooftops, everybody be like them. But at the same time, you've got to have an even keel and playing fairly across the board.
Yeah, Wayne, one of my goals always has been, and this is where it covers cross topics that we've talked about, traditionally, getting back to your egocentric people, typically they feel the need to be involved with everything, and everything has to come to them, and they prove their validity by being involved in everything. And I'm just the reverse. I want my team, if I get hit by a truck, or maybe more positively, if I hit the lotto and I'm not around anymore, it should just keep going, and that's what keeps an organization moving quickly and efficiently. If I, as a senior leader, have to be involved in everything with one of my generals, then I can't do what I need to do to get my job done. I can't be moving, strategizing, all the other things I should be doing in my role. And it just slows everything down. It hurts everybody. Hurts me, hurts them. So I guess I never understood that whole micromanagement up to a senior level. When you're earlier or certain levels, there's probably more of that. But as you evolve into senior management, you really got to get out of some of that stuff, to lack a better term.
Yeah. So maybe this might be a good closing story on that topic. So this goes into a couple of areas. One is you never know necessarily who you're going to affect and the effect you're going to make on someone's life as a leader, and how important that is. But hiring people who are competent and have expertise and turning them loose on the problem is a skill in its own. And I remember when we were working together, there was a big project to implement a nationwide CRM slash ERP sort of ish across an entire national organization. And the way this came about was this organization had signed a large client, but we didn't necessarily have the capability to service that client correctly with back end rigor and functionality. So I built something. I hosted an app in my own home on a server to do this. And I said, look, I've got to build this, or this client, we're going to fail this client. And I remember showing this to you and some other folks, and it said, look, I mean, this might be too heavy ham-handed of a word, but it was almost like shaming the organization and saying, this is where you should be, and this kid from California put this thing together in his house. We need to do something. So you handed me a project that was a huge project, a huge spend for the company, and I had demonstrated some credibility to you, and I remember I remember where I was. I was in Michael's Art Supply on the phone with my kid, and we're talking about the project. And you asked me, said, "Do you have this? Are you going to let me down on this, or something to that effect?" And I said, "Absolutely not. I will not." And I just remembered the confidence that you put in me when you have someone like me, and there's a lot of people like me in FM. We're competent people. We know what to do. If we don't, we will reach out to you for help. Trust us. We have no shame or ego about that. The egocentric people don't make good FMs, or psychopathic people. FMs tend to be very grounded people. But I remember that, and it was not only a challenge and a reach for me, but it was also something, it stretched my capabilities, but it was fun because I liked reporting back to you the progress and the things, and you let me run and do those things. And I'll always remember that in my career, that was something. Do you remember that project in those days?
Yeah, I do. That was huge.
Yeah.
I did trust you. I mean, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. And see, I think a lot of leaders, when they give that to somebody, you're giving a piece of yourself, and I knew you were there to backstop anything if I had trouble, both with your own input and resources and so forth. And what was kind of fun is that I even got to, when you do, again, like we've been talking about, when you try to implement change, how hard it is and the resistance you get from change, and people are doing things one way for a decade or so, and you come in and change things. Remember, I asked our events team to set up two projectors in the large ballroom, and one projector had the new system and one projector had the old system. And I picked the top person in the company that resisted the change and said they could do it better with the old system. And I said, okay, well, let's do it live in front of the entire company.
Yeah.
And you start and I start, and I was done in like 22 seconds, and they hadn't even begun. And I mean, and it was fun, it's lighthearted and light spirited, but it was a fun thing to do. And just remember that feeling of accomplishment that, versus some other executives who I worked with that, like you're saying, had to have their fingerprints on something just to have them on something. So, how, I guess this is my last question to you, Craig. We kind of close with this. When you look back in your career and the things that you've accomplished, and you can look at successful companies and so forth, what are you proud of? What do you, or what, I mean, and I know you're not a guy that's going to beat his own chest about being proud of something, but where are you looking back and saying, something that was a good thing that I'm pleased to have been part of that, or that person's life? What do you look back on, and what do you think?
Wayne, I will answer that, but I do want to say one more. Once again, I would say one more thing about the last thing, because it's very important for people, again, going from middle to upper management. And that is, it was implicit in what you said. And that is when I or you or anyone as a senior manager allows someone to do what I let you do, it's calculated risk, right? And unfortunately, one like that wasn't even math. It was more, do I trust Wayne? Do I think he has internally what it takes? I know technically he's very smart, but can he do all this other stuff? And in my mind, the answer was yes. But my point in raising that is, as a senior leader, the higher you go, the more calculated risk you got to make. And the risks only get bigger and bigger and bigger. And you got to get comfortable. I mean, it gets to your, pillow thing. Can I sleep at night? And managers moving up, part of that is, can they make that move or not? Are they willing and comfortable taking much more risk in their business decisions than they have in the past? And I just think that's worth noting. Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
As far as the things I'm most proud of, Wayne, it's really, I don't know. It was probably around when we first met, which is a while ago now, that I realized that, I satisfied my ego in proving an awful lot of things to myself about myself and accomplishments. And that's where I really began to realize that I don't really get any satisfaction out of personally achieving anything. I really get more satisfaction out of watching people grow into the people they're capable of. And I'll give you an example. The last company I led, I hired someone to lead sales in our biggest area. And, one of our, hiring criteria was you had to have a college degree. Well, this person didn't have a college degree. So, so in my way, I went and had the job redefined. So, you could have a certain level of experience and not a college degree. And I brought her in, and she just did phenomenally. And what I did, what I like to do is incrementally give people more responsibility, right? Here's something, see if you can achieve it. If you do, then, I'll give you something else, and on and on and on. And she was just so open and was growing. And it was, a college degree is completely irrelevant to the subject. And I'm not trying to discredit college degrees. I got more degrees than I need. My point is, it was so awesome to watch her grow and achieve the things she did. And it's not what I did, it was all her skill. I just allowed her, I gave her the environment to do that, and to me, that's an awesome feeling. That is just an incredible feeling, because it's just, I don't know, like I said, you hit that point in your career where, I made a hole in one, right? I don't need to make any more hole in ones. I want to see other people do that, Hopefully that answers your question.
A bullseye. Yeah, that's the people that I look up to, mentors like yourself, like Kit Tuvison, a fellow who's passed on, Tina Schaus and Lynn Baez and other folks in our organization here at IFMA that I look up to. That's their MO. You know them by the trail of successful people and people respecting them that they leave behind. It's you can follow the trail in the water and say, "Gosh, who's making all these people leaders and giving of themselves?" And you get up to the boat. Oh, it's there's Craig driving the boat, and I think that's a great place for us to leave it here, because I think that's the legacy that we want to leave as leaders. It's a tough road and a tough road to hoe some days, for sure. But laying the head on the pillow, both from I don't have anything to regret today, and then also to dream a dream about all the people's lives that you've touched, I think is a great way to end the day. So,
well, you gotta be humble, right, Wayne?
yeah.
To me, that's hard to teach somebody. I think some of that has to be natural, and you're willing to give somebody else a trophy instead of you needing the trophy. Is another simple analogy, and it's anyway.
Yeah.
It's been great, Wayne. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Me too, Craig. And I don't think this will be the last time that we do this. I really appreciate you carving out the time for us and the council and IFMA at large. And I would just encourage everyone here at the end, if you have not joined IFMA, if you're watching this as a non-member, I encourage you to join IFMA International in your local chapter. And if you'd like to join the Corporate Facilities Council or one of our other councils and communities that serve different verticals in the market, I encourage you to do that and take advantage of all the great resources and other leaders we have here at IFMA. So, Craig, thanks again on behalf of the council and IFMA. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks again, Wayne. I appreciate the time.